Day.
13 years.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Billy Sunday Show. We are live streaming on Facebook. And I have my boy, say hello, 13.
Hello people.
And today the topic is women's rights. And it's a big day. It's a big day for women's rights.
Yep.
And my guy here, 13, loves women's rights.
Very much.
And so, women's rights and the Billy Sunday Show have a lot in common. I am here at the behest of all the women in my life. And Billy Sunday very much enjoys the company of, his wife, my wife, and really the women's rights has always been a big issue for me. And whenever I think of women's rights, the first thing that I think of here is women's suffrage. That is the biggest thing that I think of is women's suffrage, because women's suffrage is the right to vote. And we live in a political world. And if you don't have the right to vote, well, then you don't really have a whole lot. There's not really a whole lot that you have. So, women's suffrage has a long history in America, especially America and Great Britain. We are two countries that are known throughout the world for having very progressive histories of women's rights and women's suffrage. Isn't that right, 13?
Very.
Very right. That's very right. And so when you look back, most of the movements for women's rights started in earnest around the Civil War era. And a lot of people who were abolitionists were also fought for women's rights. So a lot of the people who were fighting to free the slaves also teamed up with people who were fighting for women's rights and trying to guarantee the vote for women. They very much worked hand in hand. And we have a couple big names in terms of that era. We have Harriet Beecher Stowe, Native, which I'm sure a lot of people might recognize. Harriet Beecher Stowe and MZ Productions, Eric Mitchell. What's up, guys? Talking about women's rights. Those are just a couple guys who I know are all about women's rights. MZ and Eric Mitchell, my guys out there. My buddies, we all keep it real. We keep it 100 when it comes to women's rights. We keep it 100.
Yeah.
Right? Chicken nugget?
Right.
13? 13, is it 13 or chicken nugget?
13.
Okay, 13. But if you could buy 13 chicken nuggets, you would definitely do that.
I'd be very happy.
That would make you happy. That's good. We like it when people are happy here. MZ Productions, man. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. MZ, my man, up on his intellectual knowledge of Harriet Beecher Stowe. He knows what's good. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the books that people actually credit with starting the Civil War, and was very much a part of American history. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived in Hartford, here in Connecticut, and I don't know, have you ever been to the Harriet Beecher Stowe house, 13?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, if you grow up in like the Hartford area, at some point, they'll probably make you go in or around the Harriet Beecher Stowe house. So a lot of people, especially around here, know Harriet Beecher Stowe. And, yeah, that is hashtag equal rights. That's what we're all about here. Susan B. Anthony, also, somebody who was very influential in women's rights, women's suffrage in that era, the like 1800s kind of era. Susan B. Anthony. It's hard to overstate just how revolutionary Susan B. Anthony was, because she was a woman who was fighting for women's rights, and it's not like nowadays where you have a very strong movement of women's rights. Back in like the 1800s or whatever, if you were a woman, you couldn't own property, you couldn't vote, you couldn't even like do anything basically. Like you couldn't like walk out in the street.
Yeah, it was very limited back then.
Very limited. And so fighting for women's rights in her age was probably something equivalent to fighting for women's rights somewhere in like Saudi Arabia or like some country where women are still very much kept in the house and not allowed to be part of like the everyday social life. That's essentially what Victorian era America was like. Women very much, physically forced to be in the house. And so for her to stand up and be a champion of women's rights, especially at that time, is pretty huge. It's pretty huge. And she was a member of the Women's Rights Convention, which took place in Worcester, Mass. Had the very first, right here in New England, had the very first Women's Rights Convention. So a lot of women's rights and women's rights movements are centered here in New England, and a lot of them in Massachusetts. A lot of them take place in or around Boston, Massachusetts, and the big name from that is Susan B. Anthony. A lot of people have probably heard. Have you ever heard of Susan B. Anthony?
I've probably heard the name, but I don't know much about the person.
Yeah, you probably have, but Susan B. Anthony was a reformer. She was an activist. She did a lot of things, and she's basically a woman, a pioneer for women's rights, women's suffrage, and was there through the bitter end. And she is one of the, fact check this one, 2 women on American currency. Susan B. Anthony and Sacagawea. So, what up, P-Var? What up, bro? I know P-Var likes Sacagawea. Him and Sacagawea roll deep because Sacagawea is from out west, out into the heartland, and that's from my guy Patrick from Midwest Riders. Sacagawea was out in the Midwest, and she's on the dollar. She's on that golden dollar. Susan B. Anthony is also, I think she had. That's just how influential she was. Is that she's actually on money. American woman, not just women, but all people who enjoy freedoms and liberties in America enjoy a lot to Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony is part of the reason why we can have fun on this podcast. You know, if it weren't for Susan B. Anthony, I wouldn't be even here on this podcast being able to talk so openly about people calling me names like Silly Buns, which is, I think that's going to be my new podcast, is going to be Silly Buns.
Silly Buns.
That's just the name of my podcast. So that is Silly Buns here, just talking, and it's a little bit silly, and that is just a freedom that I enjoy. I can talk about silly things, say silly buns, and, people think it's funny, and, they don't think, some people probably think that it's kind of stupid, but most people don't really care. And, a lot of these rights and these freedoms, if they weren't fought for by women like Susan B. Anthony, I wouldn't be able to have these kinds of freedoms. So we do, not just, women, but I feel that a lot of people in general, men and women, every race, creed, and color, every whatever. Susan B. Anthony, she was cool. I like Susan B. Anthony. And there were also a lot of women fighting not only for women's rights, but also women of color also had a very difficult time and fought for rights, and not just rights like they were fighting to vote, but they also had more basic rights like living rights free from being harassed or the threat of death, essentially. And we have a woman, Ida, who was a woman who fought. She fought for her rights. She didn't fight in a war or anything, but she fought very much so for her rights during that era, during the turn of the century, post-Civil War era. And she ran a newspaper that was a bunch of her friends who had been lynched, unfortunately. And she was so just taken aback and distraught that she devoted the rest of her life to fighting for rights for women of color, and started an anti-lynching campaign and went on public tours and speaking events for the rest of her life. So Ida B. Wells is also someone who's very influential. And we have another woman more famous, Sojourner Truth, who was a very well-known public speaker. Sojourner Truth was a public speaker who, a religious awakening in which she was renamed Truth. Her last name was renamed to Truth. And she was also a public with Frederick Douglass, and she spoke with a lot of different people. She went all around America touring after the Civil War, talking about rights for everybody. And she gave up a lot so that we could all be free. One particular convention in Akron, Ohio, a speech about how women aren't really, she said that women are just as strong as men, and that women need to be given their shot. And that's one of the most famous speeches in her time, was from her. She was very eloquent, very well-spoken, and she definitely had that spirit. She had some kind of spirit. There was a spirit that she had, Sojourner Truth. And we also owe a great debt to her. We owe a great debt to all of the women who fought, because as long as one person isn't allowed to have their rights, then all of us aren't allowed to have our rights, because we're all united. We're all one family. So when one person suffers, then we all suffer. When one person doesn't have their rights, we don't have our rights. Yep. And this is the United States of America, and we all enjoy these rights and these freedoms because of the people who went before us. Also, Mary Eliza Church Tyrrell went to enjoy a bachelor's degree, to enjoy a college degree. So was a teacher in one of the first all-black high schools. So she near in her day and age, a lot of women fighting for rights, not just for women, but for all kinds of people. And we also come at that point, you would, hit just in the history of women's suffrage is this like crash course that I like to do here, the little crash course moment in Billy Sunday is the amendment that guaranteed women the right to vote, the 19th Amendment, which was in 1920. We have, finally, after a long and arduous journey, the guaranteeing of women's rights, that they could vote and that they could basically become a political force in this country. And finally, after all of the hatred and all of the discrimination, we have women guaranteed the right to vote. 1920 in America. A big step, a huge step for America, for women, and for all people across the world, across the universe. Women getting the right to vote, having a voice, having a political force, having a movement, a change for good, something that we can see is going to progress, something that will eventually tackle the issues of this world, of everything. And that is the one big thing that I ran into when I was researching this show, was that how women and girls are very much a driving force in change and can very much solve a lot of the huge issues that we currently are faced with in society. In women and girls that we in this country, in this universe, for the better. And a lot of that came to fruition. We have the passing of the 19th Amendment. We have the Civil Rights era, which is due in large part to women's ability to vote, changing the face of the American political scene forever. We have the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, which didn't just guarantee women the right to vote, because that was important, but it also guaranteed no discrimination in workplaces, in hiring, and that was huge because, yeah, you can vote, but you can't get a job, and if you do get a job, you're going to be doing the worst job at the lowest pay. So that was what women were facing, and it was legal. There was nothing really that could be done about it until the 60s, until John F. Kennedy, rest in peace, set this up, and then his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Civil Rights Act, which guaranteed all of these freedoms. And again, these are freedoms that were fought for by women, voted into reality by women, by all different kinds of people, men and women together. And that was the crowning achievement, I think, in the last, how many, maybe a decade since we've had any real legislation that's done anything good for this country. I would say since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we probably haven't had, everything's kind of gone backwards since then. We've got a lot of things that are being repealed or that are being made illegal or things like that that are kind of moving us backwards in terms of social progress in the last, maybe the 60s and the 70s were good, but 80s and the 90s, and then recently things have just kind of started to move backwards instead of forwards. And we have, from there, we have a brief history, but also I like to dig deeper than just the history, because the history is one side of the coin. The history of women's rights and suffrage and feminism is one side, and the other side is the philosophy. What are the ideas? What are the basic outlooks that these people have, these women, men, all different kinds of people, transgender, that make them want to reform, that make them into suffragettes, or make them into people fighting for suffrage fighters, women's rights activists. What is it exactly? And a lot of it I found to be heavily pragmatic. Pragmatism being basically the utility of anything is its value. As long as something is useful, it is valuable. If something has no use, then it is not really that valuable. So basically our world is divided into value, into things that we can and can't use. And that is very much where I fall. I would definitely say I am a pragmatist. I haven't always called myself a pragmatist. I would definitely say, though, I am a pragmatist. In as far as I think that practicality and usefulness are things that come first in life. I wouldn't end right there and say that I'm just a pragmatist and that's it, and I'm only about using things. But I would say that you have to look at life that way. You have to look at life in a practical way. You have to look at life as, how are these things useful for me? Not even for me, because just how are these things useful in general? And then from there, how are they useful for the good of the community? How are they useful for the good of my family? All of these things in a
It's
positive
all about
way.
bettering your life.
It
Bettering
is.
life that you love.
Yeah, that's so true because it is all about being better. It's all about being positive, being a change for something that is positive in the world. And that is a lot of what drives the social reformers, and I found a lot of very similar strain of thought of this pragmatism. What can they do? The vote. That is something that is useful, something that is very practical. A vote. That is something that women can use to gain equal rights. So that is the essential paradigm that I found running through all of the suffrage movement. A lot of pragmatism, thinking about how they can use certain societal issues like the vote and the Civil Rights Act and the different political leaders of the day to enforce their political views, or to basically use them to progress in society. And that is definitely the main thing. One of the most important pragmatists, or basically feminist thinkers, was a guy, John Stuart Mill, who is very, he started this thing called utilitarianism, and thinking about things from don't fact check me on this one really, but from a utility perspective. And that is a lot of the reasons why I have the same respect for him is a lot of the reasons why I have the same respect for Susan B. Anthony, because they fought, and it's not like they did like some huge thing, like they, I don't know, invented the theory of relativity or whatever. But in my mind, what they did was even bigger, because they were fighting for women's rights in a Victorian era, when women were like, they could be divorced and they could have no right to possession, and if they lost their husband or their husband died, they would be poor and they would have nothing, and they would have nothing to take care of their children with, and things like rape in a marriage was considered impossible. So if you were married to a husband who was brutal and violent and raped you, you couldn't do anything about it. You literally couldn't do anything about it until recently, actually, fairly recently. So we're talking about very repressive. You still have Susan B. Anthony, and you have this guy, John Stuart Mill, fighting for women's rights. Even back in the day, even back when it was not, so easy. Any guy, Bill Cosby, was supposedly fought for women's rights, And he wasn't really fighting for women's rights. He was actually, one of those guys that was, being violent, not only just physically, but sexually towards women. And he fought for women's rights, So that's kind of the day that we live in. It's like, oh yeah, everybody's like, women's rights. But there was a time when you couldn't even say women's rights. People would start to get upset. You couldn't even talk about women's rights. But there were still people fighting for women's rights. John Stuart Mill was one of them. And the other big influence that I find is Simone de Beauvoir, the existentialist philosopher. She, I think, kind of by default would be considered a pragmatist, but she had her own existential way of looking at things, and she essentially said that there were a lot of things going against women. And in the second sex, she says that women have a lot of responsibility too. Don't fact check me on this one. I'm definitely cliff noting that. That was the cliff notes I read, the Wikipedia page on that one, if you can't tell. Simone de Beauvoir, she's worth a read if you're really heavy into feminism and women's rights. It is you definitely got to get into Simone. Thinker. that I am not doing anywhere near as much credit as she is due, because she is probably one of, if you think of husband, he would never have had views and points if it weren't for her. So she really was the brains behind Sartre. And if it weren't for her, there would have been no him. And if it weren't for him, then there probably wouldn't have been modern existentialism. So in a sense, Simone de Beauvoir is herself the grandmother of existentialism. So I'll give a tip of the hat to her on that one, because she was, in my mind, she just has like this vibe, you know? It's like you read her work and it's like she just has this good vibe. There's like, it's hard for me to put it any other way, but like I vibe out with de Beauvoir. She's cool. And from Simone de Beauvoir, there are also a couple other philosophers. They're just a pragmatist. She influenced Dewey. In Stone, she's more known. She fought for women's rights, women's right to vote, and she is known mostly because she says that women should be in government because women know how to do things around the house, and that working around the house, how to take care of a home, is just a small example of how to take care of the country. And that women, if they were allowed more so to be in the government, would actually be better at it than men. And I think that is very true. Maybe just by the fact of the roles that society puts them in, are better at doing certain things within government, and they should definitely be allowed to, because as we see now, the especially in certain parts of the country, women being in positions of power and in government is still very much in the minority. So Jane Addams, she was in the same time as the Susan B. Anthony and the 1800s, that whole very first reformers. And we also have the infamous Ayn Rand, who I am almost guilty by association for talking about. Yeah, it's hard for me to really talk about Ayn Rand out there, that I do feel guilty by associating, even mentioning her on my show. So we're just gonna skip Ayn Rand, because she's just not worth going into. If you know her, if you know about her, then you know why I'm saying this. And if you don't know about her, then don't even go into it. It's probably not even worth it. Because she really is. And like, there are really a lot of philosophies where you can get sucked into. And I've definitely been down that road a few times. I've been down the dark hole that is bad philosophy, which is very deep and very hard to pull yourself out of. Learn from my mistakes. Don't read any Ayn Rand. And so that I think that heavy kind of pragmatism, but not just pragmatism, but a pragmatism based on a personal kind of positive work. And here we have a beautiful woman here also who I want to say hello, Sasha Savage, my wife. Say hello.
Hello.
She has strolled into the studio, and so I got one live and in the flesh here, so that's good. Yeah, I wish I had a room mic. I wish I had another room mic, because then I could just mic up the room. We could just have all the little hijinks that always happen whenever you film a live show. There's always just little things that go on. It's just doesn't do justice unless I got everybody's voice. I need everybody's voice on this show. And we have women, we have men, we have all different kinds of people that are fought for by women in women's rights.
It's very important that we have women's rights right now, and
just supporting women, because we're coming into an age where it's just so vital that women's voices are heard, and especially when we've been in a time where women's voices have not been heard. So it's definitely important. I support any woman that is also running for any of the presidential elections coming up, and it
Oprah
definitely
Winfrey.
no, but I think there is a woman that has very proud, and I just want to say keep up the good work, women out there, and we support you and love you.
That's right, we do. And there are a lot of women, Brave America, which is where we're going right now. And if you know, this is the Freedom Highway, the Billy Sunday Show, here with 13. My God, and we also had a guest surprise appearance by Sasha. And it is about 1:32, and the date is January 26th. Shout out to any birthdays today. Hint, hint. My birthday's actually tomorrow. Not like it really matters, but I'm gonna be 32. Anyway, my birthday is to reproductive rights. The right to have a child, the right to have somebody who has a birthday. Or really, reproductive rights is actually the opposite of that. It's the right to not have a child, and it's the right to be able to plan your pregnancy, and the right to be able to plan the birth of a child in different ways, and also family planning once it does happen, to have support. And reproductive rights center around a few issues. There's the access of abortions, and there is also contraceptions, the access of, and also the non-sex ed classes being given in class. You're too young to be in sex when you're in high school, freshman. Soon. So I won't go into the nitty-gritty details. I'll spare you the nitty-gritty. But yeah, reproductive rights are basically not the rights to have children, because anybody can have a kid. It's the right to plan when you're going to have a kid. Because in America, we kind of enjoy these freedoms that were fought for by a lot of people. Countries, they aren't so set in stone. And I was we're doing a little research. You know me, I research all the time. And I came up with some facts about this, in that there are 800 women who die daily from preventable complications with pregnancy and childbirth. 800 women a day die. Just because we live in a time when medical access and care is very much segregated to the amount of disposable income you have, or your community at large has. So, that's almost 1,000 women a day who die from stuff that could have been easily prevented because of a complication during pregnancy or childbirth. That's 1,000 women a day that die. Another number that kind of shocked me was that in about 80 countries, same-sex marriages, or even just relationships in general, are illegal. So in 80 countries, you can't be gay. Yeah, that kind of blew my mind too. It's like, really? They still have laws like that on the. I guess the world isn't maybe as far advanced as we here in America like to think, but that's why we're here on the show, because I want to make people aware of what's really going on. Because as I research deeper and deeper into women's rights, just women and women's rights. It's an issue of all of us, and it's about an issue. Maybe back in 1890, it was about women in America getting the right to vote. But those times have passed, and the civil rights era has passed. And now, when one woman is not given her rights, then all women aren't given our rights. So, we as women, or men who support women, or as any transgender identity that you want to identify with, support women. We now need to bridge that gap from women, not just here, but also women all over the world, all over the universe. Women together, working together. And that was just, that's just some numbers that blew my mind, you know, because it's not just here. It's not just in America where women's rights are really the sole focus. It's mostly in the third world and in the world where, you know, they know that they should have these rights because they have the right to vote. And in their country they might even have the quote-unquote right to vote, but it's probably just in name only. And I mean, there's a lot of that going on in America too, especially recently. We've had a lot of rollback, a lot of progression that has been slowed or stopped or even reversed. A good example of that is this law that I recently learned about called the gag law, where we don't fund anything in the international community, because America gives a lot of money to international countries, well, like the world police. We won't give money to, and this is just with the recent conservative government, we won't give money to countries who support in any way reproductive rights like contraception or abortion. And actually, in the most recent one, they've expanded it to be even people who don't, who support HIV awareness and things like this. So it's actually something about $10 billion worth of aid that is now being cut off from the rest of the world. And this is called the gag law, a partisan law. It's very much what I found to be one of my most kind of, I don't know how to put it, influential things, something that just kind of influenced me right away, that just caught my eye, was this TED Talk that I saw on the website globalfundforwomen.org and, you know, britannicaalso.com, and as always the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but this one is really good, the globalfundforwomen.org. Check out that website if you're interested in doing something for women's rights around the world. globalfundforwomen.org. There's a really good TED Talk on it by this woman, Musimbi Kanyoro. Probably, you know, didn't really hit that one right, but she gives this talk about this thing in her country called Isrika. You'll have to look up the TED Talk for exactly how